conversations in which we invite people in who have expertise on a particular topic to share their ideas, to debate their ideas, to talk about policy. And so we thought that while we were here in Bangkok with people from all over the world that had incredible expertise on what was happening in their countries, that we would do some conversations here as well. So the way I had planned this was that it would be conversational, not presentations. It seems like not everybody got that email. So I ask you to, we're still going to try to do the questions, but I ask you to be, to take into consideration that not everybody had the chance to prepare the way that we had hoped, things would proceed. So, and I do hope to have an opportunity to get to conversation from the floor where you all can ask questions. And I thought, given that today's conversation is about Brexit and what it means for the United Kingdom and for Ireland, and in particular for educators and their unions, I thought we might start by talking about what Brexit means in political terms, what the referendum itself meant. And so the post-referendum polling that I saw from the other side of the Atlantic suggested that the vote laid out some pretty significant differences. Not only was it evenly split overall, but that, for example, young people were much more opposed to Brexit than older people. People with university educations were much more opposed than people with secondary school educations. People living in metropolitan areas, particularly London, were much more opposed than people living in rural areas. People in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland more opposed than people in England. And people of color much more opposed than white people. And I also saw some indications that the Labour Party base, many people thought, was split over Brexit, and that the many white blue-collar workers in the industrial areas, particularly in the north, supported it. So to the extent that this portrait is correct, it will actually be familiar to many of us from different parts of the world, because I think we saw similar divisions in the election that elected Trump. And I think wherever there is a sort of right-wing authoritarian populism arising, these divisions appear. And so there's been this big debate in the United States. To what extent was Trump's victory a consequence of class? People in the industrial heartland feeling economically left behind by decades of neoliberal policies of austerity and deregulation and privatization. And to what extent was it an issue of race, given the centrality of racial resentment and racist discourse to his election? And so I'm going to pose all of those questions to you as people who are living through this. What is your assessment of the politics? How is the Labour Party base split? How important was hostility towards immigrants, Muslims, people of color? How important were economic grievances in Brexit? Yes.
Okay, so hello, I'm Mary Bowsted, I'm Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union. I think it's a really good question. I think we have to understand that the referendum took place at a time when there had been over 8 years of austerity. That's huge cuts to public services. We've seen some government departments with cuts of up to 40% in their department spending. In fact, the Institute for Fiscal Studies said it was a complete reshaping of the British state. So if you lived in a poor area of the country, if you lived in the areas of the country like the big manufacturing areas in the north where manufacturing has gone, if you lived in the coastal areas like Blackpool with seasonal labour, I've been to a school in Blackpool where 98% of the population move every 6 months. So 98% of the population from when they start secondary school to finish it have moved. I recently went to Doncaster, which is a poor town in the north. If you go to Doncaster and you go down the high street, the windows are boarded up. There's either charity shops or boarded up shops. It used to be a proud industrial northern town built on wool and woolen manufacturing. And if you go to those places, which have suffered for years from no manufacturing policy, either actually from New Labour or the Tories, no manufacturing policy, a very weak regional policy, which means that the poor areas, the areas which didn't have the high-tech, the big service industries were just left to decline. And if you take into account the huge overheating of London, which drags resources and people in, and you say to people on low-paid, insecure work, who are working 2 or 3 jobs and still can't make the ends meet, and you say to them, do you know, vote Remain and remain in the European Union, because if you don't, it'll get worse. They say, how much worse can it get? The second issue was that Brexit was never, to leave or to remain in the EU was never a question that should have been asked. It was actually a question asked of the electorate to settle a row within the Conservative Party. It's a row in the Conservative Party which had rumbled on for 40 years. John Major, a Prime Minister in the 80s, said famously on tape that he would be able to govern if it wasn't those bastards in his party banging on about Brexit. So the question was asked by David Cameron, the then Prime Minister, to settle a row in the Conservative Party. And the answer that was given was only ever partially about Brexit. The answer that was given by poor, white, working class people was about the state of their lives, the state of their jobs, the lack of hope, the lack of a belief that it would be any worse outside. And it's also born out of a huge frustration with the South East and with London. Of course London wants to stay in the EU. You don't feel like that if you're in Portsmouth and you've got a low-paid, insecure job. So it was about settling a row within the Tory party, and it was about all sorts of other things, and it took place, the vote took place, just after years and years and years and years of austerity. We have in the UK, we have in England, 30% of children living in poverty. 70% of those 30% who live in poverty live in working households. So it's not that parents haven't got jobs, it's that parents have got jobs, and that's rising exponentially. So the UN rapporteur to the human rights came to the UK and said our child poverty rates are a disgrace. They're a disgrace, and the government didn't like it, but it's true. So if you have poor people living in poverty, insecure work, low-paid work, where the government seems to have declined, and you add on to that, both from Labour and the Tories, the EU is a whipping boy for everything that's gone wrong in our industrial, in our manufacturing, in our regional policy. Don't blame us. The EU's been a very convenient, it would all be all right if it wasn't for those Europeans telling us we've got to eat straight bananas, which Boris Johnson said, or telling us that kippers have to have ice pillows for their heads, which Boris Johnson said, all of which are lies. If it hadn't been for Boris Johnson saying, leave the EU, written on the side of a bus, and our NHS, our National Health Service, the jewel in the crown, will get £350 million a week, which was a lie, and which he was told by the UK Statistics Authority that it was a lie, and he had to stop saying it, and he ignored them. If you say that to people, then you will get that result. And there's no doubt also that immigration played a huge part of that. So it was dog whistle politics around, if we control our own borders, if we get back our sovereignty, then we can stop this high level of immigration. Now, there's one more thing I'll say about that. There wouldn't have been the antipathy and the antagonism towards immigration if we were a low-paid, insecure economy where employers were undercutting a living wage. The immigration became a scapegoat for poor employment practice in England and in the UK, and all of that combined to the shock vote of 52% leave, 42% remain.
Patrick? Well, I mean, thanks very much for the invitation, Patrick Roach, NASWT, representing members across the UK, so England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Thanks, Leo, for your succinct question. I mean, it does feel like an invitation to a thesis. That's not a criticism, by the way. And also for your suggestion that this audience will be speaking to the experts. Well, Mary and John can speak for themselves, but I certainly don't regard myself as an expert in the murky world of Brexit. I actually think that the issues with regard to Brexit puzzle us all back at home in the UK, as much as I'm sure they puzzle, confuse and confound you. And you're probably thinking, well, you know, is what I'm reading in the press actually true? Is this really what's happening? Are they really suggesting that they're going to be leaving the European Union? Did they really vote in that way? Well, actually, I don't think your media is necessarily being filtered. The fact is, it is true, and it is pretty incredible stuff. How did we get here? I guess is at the thrust of your question, and I guess to some degree, what can we learn from that? And I hope we get on to talking about how unions can respond to some of that. But certainly, how did we get here? Firstly, I think just simply an act of sheer political miscalculation. Mary's alluded to that already. Every time I see images of David Cameron, I come out in a rash. Let's not forget.
I bet television.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. But I come out in a rash. I mean, let's not forget this is the guy that gambled with the UK's future twice. Once he just about managed to win that. That is to say, to keep the UK whole. That is, Scotland didn't vote to leave the UK, and he thought, well, second time lucky, and no threshold whatsoever put in relation to the UK's decision to leave the EU. And of course, the consequences of that are absolutely profound. So that's the first issue that I would point to in terms of political miscalculation. I also think that we have to bear in mind that since David Cameron, we've had obviously Theresa May, who's also miscalculated on the question of whether a deal could be struck. Maybe she was handed a poisoned chalice, some would argue, and it's very difficult in that circumstance, particularly given that Theresa May had voted to remain, to deliver on Brexit. What was Brexit in any event? Was Brexit just a case of leaving the EU with nothing in place, or leaving the EU with some form of deal? That's not the question that was put to the British people. The question was put to the British people as to whether or not they wanted to leave the EU. But I think there have been miscalculations by the Tories, by the Conservative Party, all the way along. I'm not going to repeat some of the points that Mary has raised about poverty and inequality within the UK. I would urge you, as Mary has referred to read that UN rapporteur's report. It is a scathing report on the extent of poverty and inequality within the UK. I have to say, I've never read anything. From an agency like the UN, so coruscating against a major industrialised or post-industrial nation. I think in the words, I'm paraphrasing here, in the words of the UN rapporteur, that if a government had set out to develop and to implement policies which would systematically discriminate against women in particular and children, they couldn't have come up with a better plan than the Conservatives have been enacting since 2010. So it's a really, really powerful piece of work from the UN rapporteur. But you know, this question about class and race, it feels like a perennial question. Certainly in the UK, and I'm sure in the United States as well. And I'll come on to that in a moment. But I think there is an issue about the electorate's and knowledge, information and awareness of what Brexit actually meant when they went to the polls for that referendum. The lies, the damn lies, the misinformation that was being peddled as part of that Brexit campaign. Not just in terms of, what a UK watchdog might say about the information that was being put out by the Vote Leave campaign, but how that campaign was also being bankrolled. Quite illegally, it transpires, bankrolled, to deliver the kind of result that was delivered. And you saw, the very close margin between those voting to remain and those voting to leave. But I mean, there have been other polls, and I mean, I don't know if I always trust opinion pollsters, but there have been other polls since then. There's also been an EU Parliament election, which the UK was forced into participating in. And there's a lot of talk in the press, and you may have seen some of that on your side of the pond, about the rise of the Brexit Party. Well, we've all heard of Nigel Farage. He's wined and dined by Mr. Trump. I don't know if you know him, but anyway, apparently the next best British Prime Minister, or the best Prime Minister that hopefully Britain will never have. Although I do wonder about that, given that later this week we're probably going to end up with Boris Johnson. But anyway, that's another matter. I mean, it really is a toss-up between the two of them. Yeah, the Brexit Party carved out just shy of a third of the share of the vote in the EU Parliament elections. The Tories ended up in a woeful place with less than 10% of the vote. But if you take Labour, if you take the Liberal Democrats, and you take the Greens together, their share of the vote, 46% versus 41% for Brexit/Tories. So it does suggest that actually the tide has shifted the other way. That actually, whether it's on the basis of national identity, race or class, that actually the British population is saying, well, now that we know a bit more about this question of Brexit, we ain't so sure that Brexit is the right thing for us. And let's not forget, there have been some fairly impoverished areas of the UK. Scotland and Northern Ireland certainly don't enjoy the advantages of London and, as it were, the Greater London conurbation, but they voted also to remain, and I think we should not lose sight of that. And if you think about minority ethnic populations, because there was a bit of a hypothesis in my head as to whether or not it was metropolitan constituencies that were more likely to vote to remain because perhaps they were more ethnically diverse. Well, actually, that's true up to a point, but beyond that point, it ceases to be true. So if you look at Scotland, if you look at Northern Ireland, yes, there's diversity, but not at the scale that you might find in areas like London. The third point I would mention in relation to your invitation to a dissertation, Leanne, is a hostile environment. The anti-immigrant rhetoric that was peddled as part of the Vote Leave campaign. And yes, the lies and damn lies, absolutely true. But absolutely, what was front and centre in that campaign was an anti-immigrant rhetoric. And I have to say, and I don't know, John and Mary will have a view about this, but I take the view that as a movement, we were slow and uncertain about how to respond to that. We, in a sense, how do you generate a narrative which counters the narrative of, look, the white working classes are suffering, and they're suffering at the expense of, or as a result of, a pampered, black, Asian immigrant communities residing in the UK. And that was something that was being peddled very, very openly throughout that campaign. The precedents of that were set back in 2010-11 by Theresa May, who was then Home Secretary, of course, yes, who enacted a policy of a hostile environment to, so-called bogus the language itself, it is deplorable, but bogus asylum seekers in the UK. A bit like the language of, well, you know, if you don't like it in the UK, or if you've got some carping criticism about the UK, perhaps go back to your own country and fix your own broken societies. I don't know who said that, but somebody recently said that. Sounds like, yeah. I have to say, Randy, it's worrying, isn't it? So the same language, it's the same hairstyle. I don't know, but there seems to be something about that. But anyway,
maybe it's the same person.
Oh no, I don't think so. But that hostility towards immigrants was being the seeds of that were being sown in 2010-11. I'd actually argue the seeds of that have always been with us in the UK. Certainly since if you like, the major post-war settlements of migrants from the Commonwealth into the UK to build our National Health Service, to build our infrastructure in post-war Britain. There's always been this tension, this rivalry between the rights of black and minority ethnic citizens in the UK and the need to control the numbers of them for fear, as Margaret Thatcher said at the time, for fear of Britain becoming swamped. That was her language back in the early 1980s. So a real sense in which that immigration card was being played. Mary said, dog whistle politics, absolutely right. And the consequences of that since the 2016 referendum, huge spike in relation to hate crimes right across the UK, on our streets, in our communities, in our schools. And that's also really, really important. The NSPCC identified that following the Brexit referendum, race hate crimes had risen by a fifth to 29 a day. 29 race hate crimes against children every day since 2016. I mean, it's absolutely appalling. So you can immediately see how the electorate was being stoked up, either fear, anxiety, a sense in which, well, actually, the politics of envy, whatever that is. I mean, they've got nothing, but I feel I've got even less. So we need them out. I mean, that seemed to be the politics of the day. So race and class was certainly being combined, but I don't think that's because white working class people in the UK are any more racist than they've ever been. Actually, it's the way in which political leadership is being exercised to create divisions and to exploit those divisions within our society. And there is an opportunity, I think, for us within the movement to do something about that.
So John, you have a front row seat on a train wreck, but the train seems to be heading right towards your seat. Why don't I think people may fully appreciate the effects of a potential Brexit on Ireland. So why don't you fill us in on that?
Well, first of all, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you. I'm John McGon. I'm General Secretary of the Teachers Union of Ireland. And lest that sounds like an appropriation of Ireland, I'd better make it clear we are one of several teacher unions in Ireland. We represent teachers at second level in further and adult education and in technological institutes and now technological universities. I just want to give context to Ireland. I think I just need to make a couple of comments which I can make with impunity because I'm sort of outside the jurisdiction of which I'm speaking. So with impunity, I want to say the following. Whether it is correct or not, I'm not entirely sure, but it's a view. There has always, there are two countries to which Ireland is enormously indebted in terms of receiving our immigrants as immigrants. The UK and the US. So we have a huge level of indebtedness to two countries which have been extraordinarily generous through history. That's the first point that needs to be made. And the UK remains a generous location for immigrants for the most part. That also needs to be said. It is not a hostile place to which to go. My son has gone to the UK is living there. He is married to a woman from the US. They are living there in the UK. It is not hostile by dint of DNA, quite the reverse. But there has always been a subcurrent that can be tapped into, that can generate hostility. And it crosses the political divide in the UK, as it does in the US, I think, as well. Mosley led what was largely a working class group who became fascist under his direction because, not least, of fear of incomers and immigrants. Enoch Powell in the 70s identified the possibility of rivers of blood, was it in the Wolverhampton speech? So it has always been there as a source to be tapped into if political systems fail. And what I think has happened in the UK above everything else and before everything else is that there has been a complete abdication of political responsibility by all political parties, bar none, bar none. Now, the most egregious failure has been in the Tory party, because there are people who have traditionally been able to, with impunity, draw upon, if you like, that subcurrent. And they've been prepared to do it.
Oh, yeah.
They have done it intermittently. But I'm going to focus on the Labour Party. Because the Labour Party has been at best ambivalent, and at worst, a lot worse than ambivalent. And it was the bounden duty of the Labour Party not to be ambivalent. Not about Brexit, not about race, not about anything of that nature. So there was an absolute failure, which is an ongoing failure. And much as I admire a lot of what Jeremy Corbyn has done, I think he let himself down profoundly on this issue by not defining a position for his party and for those people in the hinterland, in the economically deprived areas, by not generating hope for them through political measures and allowing them instead to fall prey to this predatory sort of conservative stream. The other thing, Brexit is a profoundly English political movement. It is profoundly not a Scottish political movement. It's not a Northern Irish political movement.
Although you're represented by the DUP in Northern Ireland too.
Yes, but even within the DUP, there are fissures. For example, the agricultural support within the DUP was probably a Remain vote.
Yeah.
But the unionist tradition in the DUP, the unionist tradition in Northern Ireland, and the generality of the populace in Northern Ireland did not wish to go this route. So it is very English, and as you have said, it's not even just that. It's home counties English.
Yeah.
It's the city England as well, because the people, incidentally, who are now in charge of the political party had a previous incarnation, most of them, as bankers.
Yeah.
So this is their second go within about 15 years at ruining the country, economically as well as every other way. So, in a sense, a political failure allowed David Cameron, assisted in turn by Theresa May, both of whom were Remainers, and jumped upon now by Boris Johnson and others. You now have the attempt by politicians to regain the trust of the electorate, but they are attempting to regain it by providing them with a bag of wind of false promises that cannot in any circumstance be delivered upon. The most egregious thing is that they have played fast and loose, and this is to come to Ireland, with something of absolutely a monumental consequence, which is life or death consequence. And that is the peace process, the Good Friday Agreement, which is a separate international treaty registered with the United Nations, into which the UK government entered with the Irish government, assisted in large part, it has to be said, by brokers and good faith brokers from the US, such as Lord Mitchell, assisted by the Clinton administration, assisted by de Chastelain from Canada. So utterly and completely indifferent were these people to the citizenry that they claimed to be saving from something worse than a type of colonisation. In Irish terms, there has been genuinely significant progress since, well, from before 1999, but since the Good Friday Agreement was signed. There was genuinely significant disappointment that the progress has not been greater. But at least you had a path where your disappointment was channeled into a disappointment at the pace of progress rather than the absolute absence of progress. Now, with the UK removing itself either in an ungainly fashion or in a semi sort of recumbent fashion or in a semi-coherent fashion from the EU, what you have is a guarantee, one way or the other, either hard Brexit or managed Brexit, one way or the other. It is in every respect disruptive of good things.
Yeah.
It is disruptive of economic flow, it's disruptive of supply chains, it's disruptive of the mutuality in terms of reciprocal recognition of qualifications, it is disruptive of human rights protections that are currently enshrined and available to all under UK law in the 1990 Act, or 1998 Act, the Human Rights Act, which will become a victim
Yes.
of the hard Brexit. Specific commitments given on human rights by the UK government in terms of a Bill of Rights, those commitments have not yet been honoured. In the Republic, where we have come from a standing start, quite frankly, in respect of equality issues, in a relatively short period to having a pretty spectacular referendum in terms of marriage equality. Our fellow islanders, I'll call us that for want of a better term, in Northern Ireland, do not have that. But they should already have it under an existing international agreement. And that's, to come back full circle, that's at a level before you put in place a border. Now, if there's anything that you shouldn't do in Ireland, it's raise more flags.
Yeah.
I mean, the toxicity of the iconography that sort of pockmarks our history is something we don't want back. We can have respect for emblems and respect for flags, provided we don't apply a barrier where they exist. And what is now in prospect are barriers where there have not been barriers for a long, long time. What is in prospect is that communities will be forced to observe a divide that they have willed away. And why? I'm minded of Shakespeare. May as well use a really profoundly good English source to address an English question. And it is an English question. I mean, what does Shakespeare say? As flies to wanton boys are we to the gods, they kill us for their sport. Well, now it's as flies to eat on boys are we to the gods, they kill us for their sport. And that's wrong.
You have that Irish book right there. So let me ask one last question that draws together some themes. And so there is something about Brexit which is particular to all of you as education unions, because whereas we generally know about the economic devastation it could cause, I don't think on this, well, we're no longer on this side, but when we're back in the United States, on our side of the Atlantic, we're fully aware of the impact on education. So I was wondering if you could talk about what you are doing as unions to address that particular issue, and Also, what appears to us now, at least, to be a process where the possibility of a soft or managed Brexit seems to be disappearing between a polarized hard Brexit from the Boris Johnson types and Labour having now finally moved towards calling for a second referendum.
Well, have they? So I just want to address John's, before I move on to education, I just want to address John's points about Labour. And Labour did campaign in the referendum for Remain. But there was a suspicion, a big suspicion, that Jeremy Corbyn, who in the 60s and 70s wanted to leave the EU because it's a neoliberal construct which was imposing globalisation on the UK and imposing economic and industrial policies which were about privatisation and around neoliberal policies. There was a suspicion that he didn't campaign that hard. I do think the Remain had a harder job to do, it's a harder sell, because it's harder to say this can be better because people have it as it is, rather than this can be a lot better when we move to this new promised land. The new promised land hasn't been created, so it's always better out there for what you're going to from where you are. I think Labour's position now is really difficult, and I think what Patrick said about 46% are voting Remain. The problem is that they're split. The problem is that Labour got 18% in the European elections, and there's no doubt that the Labour vote declined hugely because Labour would not come out clearly for either a second referendum or what I think Labour should do, which is come out for Remain. So what you do is you get the vast majority of the Labour Party members, I'm a Labour Party member, you get the vast majority of them saying, we want to remain in the EU. You get the Labour Party absolutely terrified about its northern vote leave constituencies and losing 30 or 40 seats in the north because if they come out for Remain they might lose those seats, although the polling does say coming out for Remain will rescue many Labour votes. And you've got this turmoil in the Labour Party which has been supposedly solved, although not at all, by this conundrum, which is this. The Labour Party opposes a Tory Brexit deal and opposes no deal. If Labour gets elected in a general election, it will seek to renegotiate a deal. Depending on how good that deal is, it will put that deal to the public. And if we're faced with a Tory deal or a no deal, Labour will go Remain, which is an equally confused position. Yeah. It's just very hard. And when the big Labour-affiliated unions brought that to the TUC executive, you have to be quite careful, because it's taken them months to negotiate it. You have to be quite careful. But I just wrote on the side, when it comes, if we don't get a general election, I wrote, will this work? And then I had to be quite careful about my speech in the TUC executive, saying, rather than this won't work, but will this work? In other words, who will understand this position? And it isn't clearly understandable. So I do think that the Labour Party have not come out well in the Brexit campaign and in what's happened afterwards. But I think it was difficult for them to do so. I think there were real internal pressures. But they have remained too long saying, well, we want another general election. Well, why would the Tories go for another general election now? Why would they do that? So that's the thing. Now, in terms of education, when I was General Secretary of ATL before we became part of the NEU, but ATL, the NUT, and you'll speak for the NSUWT, we didn't actually take a Remain or a vote leave position on the referendum. But what we did do was we pointed out to our members what the likely consequences of leaving would be. But here's the thing, when the people took that vote, none of them were told that it was likely that we would leave without a deal. We were told, the electorate was told when the vote was taken, that we would get fantastic deals. We had Liam Fox, the International Trade and Development Secretary, saying he would go around the world and we would have countries lining up to do trade deals with us. Lining up. We have at the moment 3 potential trade deals. And when he went to the US, and when Donald Trump came to the UK earlier this year, and he went on television, he said, you can have a great trade deal. You just leave the EU without a deal, we'll give you a great trade deal. We'll come in and we'll trade in the NHS. We'll trade in public services. Someone then told him that was a bad idea. So his next interview, he said, no, I don't think the NHS is a trading service. But he said it.
That's the National Health Service.
National Health Service. I mean, it's the closest thing that the Brits have to a religion. And, and he said, we'll trade in the NHS, we'll trade for services in the NHS, and then realised he couldn't do that. Now, it was quite difficult in the election to think what would the impact of a no-deal Brexit be on education, but we're seeing that now, and so I'll go through 3 things. The first thing is, we have seen over the last 10 years, although cuts to education and to schools have been less than to social services or to local government, we've seen real term cuts of 8% in school budgets. That's a figure ratified by the IFS. That's becoming a crisis. When our manufacturing industry declines, when our service industry declines, when the UK economy is already declining, its growth is already declining. When those decline, there will be less money to spend on public services. And we will see our schools already, school buildings falling down, already terrible conditions for people to work, already teachers being laid off, huge numbers of support staff being laid off, larger class sizes. We're seeing the first rise in class sizes for over 15 years. Secondary class sizes now getting over 30. We will see that decline and disrepair of our schools going apace, and there will be no money. There will be, we've got a Brexit windfall, but if we leave without a deal, on top of the 39 billion we have to pay back to the EU for agreements we've already got, we will see billions more being lost in our economy. We will see parents becoming unemployed. And we will see a huge increase in child poverty. And we know what child poverty does to education attainment. We know that it is the most toxic issue. We know that children born in poverty by the age of 3 have lost 11 months on their more advantaged peers. And we know that poverty, the effect of poverty increases as they go in school. So the poverty gap widens through primary and into secondary. We will see many more poor children, many more children living desperately insecure lives. And the third area where I think it will really hit is on teachers. Already we're seeing, because of endemic overwork and stress of teachers in the UK, we see teachers, increasing numbers of teachers going to teach abroad, but we've got lots of teachers from the EU and from the world teaching in UK schools. Well, if they feel insecure, if they feel unsafe, if they don't know what their legal status will be, the government makes, soothing noises, but it's not clear, then they can work elsewhere. And we're already seeing that. In fact, the NEU has just put out a film of our teachers, our members from around the world, who we just asked them, how do you feel about teaching in the UK now? And they all say, we love it here, we feel really welcome here, we love our work here, we don't want to leave our children, we feel part of the community, but I do not feel safe here any longer. I do not think I have a long-term future here, so I'm looking to leave. And so at a time when we have a massive shortage of teachers, where 40% of teachers in the UK leave before they have done 10 years teaching. 40%, and they leave because of overwork and because of a toxic assessment and testing regime. And in London and the big cities where we draw in talent from around the world to be our teachers, we will find that teacher recruitment and retention crisis getting worse. It's already the case that 1 in 5 maths and English lessons in the UK, in England, are taught by non-specialists, by teachers with no more than a GCSE in those subjects. 35% of Spanish teachers have a Spanish degree, 37% of German teachers have a German degree, 49% of science teachers have a science degree. In poor and disadvantaged schools, the majority of subjects are being taught by teachers who are not qualified in that subject. That will increase, and that will increase the intergenerational and the regional divide in educational attainment, which means that if you're in Newcastle, you're likely to get 8 points less on your A-levels, which is our end of 18, than if you're in London. 8 points there. So you will see that regional divide increase, and there will be implications for higher education. So we didn't campaign because we hadn't asked our members, And you know, I think that was wrong. Looking at where we are now, we should have been braver. We should have done that. And I regret that we didn't.
Yeah, we didn't campaign for or against Brexit either, but what we did was put information into the hands of our members in the hope and the expectation that they would make an informed decision on the day of the referendum. We continue to put information into the hands of our members, and I am really pleased that our members are demanding that we do engage politically. Another one of the legacies of Margaret Thatcher, I don't know what many, was the framework of anti-trade union legislation in the UK. Which requires unions, if they want to engage in, if you like, overtly political activity, then they have to have a regulated political fund, which members contribute to, and they have to ballot their members every 10 years on whether or not they're going to keep that fund. So all manner of obstacles put in the way. Well, our members have voted very decisively, 90% plus, that they want to keep that fund in the midst of all of this. In other words, we can see what's happening. Maybe some of our members voted Tory. Maybe some of them voted UKIP, or maybe voted Brexit Party at the last EU parliamentary elections. Maybe some of your members vote Republican. I don't know. But the fact is that we know we've got a mixed political economy within our membership, and we have to understand that. But ensuring that our members can make informed decisions, informed choices is crucially important. I think in terms of, there's a lot one could say, and to some degree Mary has said some of that already. In terms of where we are now, I think we're in extremely desperate position vis-a-vis Brexit, and what the Brexit referendum now means has to, in inverted commas, be delivered. We have a government which is in crisis, hence the leadership election within the Conservative Party, which the outcome of which the next Prime Minister will be determined by, frankly, a handful of the British people. So, somewhere in the region of 150,000 people will be determining who the next British Prime Minister is, and I'm not a gambling man, so I won't, but I think you can pretty much be assured that it will be Boris Johnson. Insofar as there's been preparatory work within government, it's woeful, it's inadequate. Because how do you plan? How do you prepare for something when you don't even know what kind of Brexit you're going to be having? Is it going to be Mrs May's deal, as it's often been coined? Is it going to be a no deal and WTO standards? Is it going to be some new arrangement, or is it just simply we've changed our mind and we're not going to bother with this anymore? We've got business that is trying to make contingency arrangements, is spending millions, billions on those contingency arrangements, only to find that they're pulled. Let's not forget, 29th of March, it came and it went. Businesses were planning for 29th of March and exit. Suddenly they find they've stockpiled and all that stuff is, frankly, the sell-by date is gone. So the next date, 12th of April, came and it went. Again, businesses would have made those arrangements. Now it's Halloween. Who knows whether or not that date is going to come and go, although according to Boris, it's Brexit do or die. That's not chilling, I don't know what it is. I don't really like horror movies, but it seems we're in the middle of one at the moment. Perhaps one of the most coherent plans that we've heard from government is troops on standby. So you can see where the UK is potentially heading. And that's all parts of the UK, but those seem to be very well developed plans. Within the movement, the TUC, certainly the British TUC, has been arguing from day one for 3 tests, but one of those tests is around effectively a people's vote, and you know, whether or not that comes to be remains to be seen. But a failure of a people's vote, in my view, means, you know, you're back to effectively a general election. But I wouldn't put any money on what the outcome of that would be. The ICTU, and John might say more about the ICTU's position, I think the position is that Brexit isn't going to work anyway for either the Republic of Ireland or for the North of Ireland. But actually a deal which provides the backstop mechanism is a deal that at least shouldn't be thrown into the rubbish heap. We are practically looking at the question of how we support our members. Members' right to work. You know, if you're an EU citizen who's working in the UK, do you still have the right to work? Mary's right. There's that issue about, you know, qualified teachers from other European countries who are teaching in the UK who say, well, actually, I'm not sure this is a context in which I want to continue teaching. And many are voting with their feet. 25% fall in teachers from the EU applying to work in the UK, 17% drop from Spain, 18% from Greece, 33% drop from Poland. But what about UK black and Asian teachers who are also experiencing the rise of rising racial hatred on their streets, in their way into work, but also in their classrooms? 37% of UK black and Asian workers are saying that they're experiencing everyday racism, and that's often fueled by that politics of hatred and that hostile environment that I described earlier. So we have to continue to provide that practical support to them, and we're doing that as a union, we're doing that as a movement. So we're talking about how we defeat the far right, the likes of Tommy Robinson et al., who are very great mates with Donald Trump and with some of Donald Trump's former advisors. We've got to defeat the politics of hate on our streets, and we've got to defeat it in our classrooms, in our workplaces. And that's why for the NSWT, that Act for Racial Justice is a cornerstone of our campaigning going forward. We have to continue to argue for the bread and butter issues which are impacting on our members: investment in schools, investment in school buildings, rewards for teachers for the job that they're doing, but also to invest in the infrastructure of support for teachers, because teachers can't do everything by themselves. And in a context in which actually austerity is biting, where poverty and inequality is actually either increasing or widening, depending on which terminology we're talking about, teachers need support. That's education support personnel working alongside teachers, but it's also local authorities and other civic institutions, because we've got a crisis on our hands as far as children and young people are concerned, which is playing itself out in our classrooms, in our schools, with an increasing frequency at the present time. And that's one of the real consequences of Brexit, that actually will impact devastatingly on the current generation of young people.
Thank you. John.
I think the thrust of your question had to do with the effect specifically on education. And if you sort of start at a macroeconomic level, the absolute guarantee with Brexit is that the UK will be tipped into recession, and that Ireland will be tipped from a growth pattern which currently sits about 4.5% per annum, back to about 2% per annum. Now that's probably an optimistic scenario, but the immediate effect of that is a squeeze on public sector spending. But we have in Ireland we have a growing school-going population. We have a growing college-going population. That's projected to last at the very least until close on 2030. So we have an absolutely acute need for a capital investment program that runs for in about 10 years, a very significant capital investment program. And we simply won't have the money for that. It's as straightforward and simple as that. We will not have the money for that because Ireland is already, because of the economic crisis, it's carrying huge debt. And while money is cheap at the moment, there are restrictions on the extent to which we can add to that debt. So we're caught by, if you like, compliance requirements with the ECB, with the European Central Bank and various other lenders. So one effect will be simply a hollowing out over time of the capital infrastructure. The other thing is that it is projected, again, probably conservatively, that the families most at risk are families that are already at risk. Now, the people who will be hit hardest here are those who are on the lowest family incomes. They're going to lose within about a period of 1 to 2 years in Ireland. They'll lose, and I'm going to try to sort of homogenise this with respect to my colleagues from the Ulster Teachers Union at Hall. They're going to lose about 4% per annum of their spending power. And they're going to face costs that will rise by 4%. So there's an immediate hit. And that immediate hit in a country that currently we get about 93% of our cohort of 18-year-olds to graduate, which is good. It's good. And we get about 60% of that cohort onto third level education, which is also good. But a lot of that is possible for those families only because they're playing at the margins. They will have no margin at which to play. So there will be an effect, almost definitely, on the possibility of progressing from post-primary education into tertiary education. That will have a consequential effect on the graduate pool available, and that will affect foreign direct investment. Because one of the reasons we have got foreign direct investment, a huge amount of it, Mr. Trump wants it back, but I won't say we're always happy to have some of the practices that come with it, but we are happy to have the jobs that come with it, because by and large they are high-end jobs. They're high-end jobs because we have a high-end graduate pool. If that pool becomes attenuated, our job structure becomes attenuated, our higher education system is affected. A more immediate effect. My son, sorry to bring this back, but let's get personal because all of these things eventually are. My son completed his teacher training qualification in England, and he did a proper course. It was not Teach First or anything of that nature. He got his qualification in England, and at this present moment, that qualification under the European directive is recognised in all of the EU states. Once Brexit happens, and particularly if a hard Brexit happens, EU directives will not have direct effect in the other countries. So he will have to rely on the jurisdictional, on the rules of the particular jurisdiction. If he were to travel, for the sake of argument, to France, he would have to hope that he met the standard currently set in France. So that is an enormous impediment in terms of the mobility of labour. And the mobility of labour is one of the key principles of the European project. It was to have people get to know one another. Get to know your neighbour, and you might love them. But if you don't get to know them, well then love is a very abstract thing. So that's going to be affected. The other thing that is going to be affected is the capacity, and this perhaps will affect the UK more than the Republic of Ireland, but the capacity to attract research staff in an environment that is enormously research-driven. Now, I'm not at all convinced that it should be as research-driven as it is. It should be more teacher-led in many instances. But given that that is where the economy sits at the moment, I think that is going to be hugely problematic. And I do agree, there will be a flight, I would think particularly of research staff from the UK, because they won't want to become pigeonholed. And it's an extraordinary decision for, along with the US and Canada and Australia, I suppose, but largely with the US, for the country that has the strongest tradition of higher education, bar none practically in the world, to throw away that competitive advantage is an extraordinarily stupid decision. So there will be effects, obviously, if you have a hard border or if you have a re-emergence of toxic emblems. You will then have huge difficulties for teachers in particular locations close to the border, because they will be managing tensions which may not become apparent until they bubble over. So the societal impact, the community impact could be considerable as well. And one other economic effect that is absolutely certain in the case of Brexit is further flight from the land, because the agri-sector is going to be hammered to death. For example, in terms of, if there's a hard Brexit, dairy produce from Northern Ireland, most of which comes south for processing, will, under the World Trade Organization tariffs, have a 36% hit. So the agri-sector is going to be mullocked, which is a word that we use in hurling parlance when somebody has just been hit hard. Right? It is going to be mullocked, and the effect of that will be further flight from the land, and the effect of that will be the closure of small schools, which we are just about sustaining, indeed favouring from the public purse. But there comes a bottom to that sort of, if you like, that provision. So are there going to be effects on education? Absolutely, absolutely. And this doesn't even take account of curricular effects. And I don't trust Whitehall, and I don't think that English teachers trust Whitehall where it comes to curriculum. And in particular, the history curriculum.
No.
I mean, history has been interfered with, revised everywhere. And in England, it has been going on for quite a while. And I just hate to think what sort of partisan, half-baked versions are going to be presented to people who will then, upon those versions, base some of the presumptions they have about their neighbours. Not good. Ladies and gentlemen, not good at all.
So on that cheery note, I would like you to join me in thanking